Hey there everyone, Pete Calandra here. On today's video, we'll be taking a look at the Steely Dan song, I Got the News. This song is found on the Asia album, and we'll be taking a look at the harmonic language used as well as some of the arranging techniques found on this track. I always think it's important when studying something to take a look at the time period during which it was created, as well as the known history of the creatives involved. In the first of this two-part video series, we'll take a look at some of the historical trends that made this album possible. And in particular, we'll focus in on how Miles Davis and his musical family tree created a situation where jazz-influenced music could be popular in the 1970s. Even though this music might not have been as popular as ABBA or Chic or Donna Summers, Asia, along with several other examples I'll talk about, had a robust audience. This album went double platinum in the United States, selling well in excess of 2 million copies. After we go through some of the historical context, we'll take a look at some of the harmonic language found in this track. Then, in the next video in this two-part series, which should come out in a week or two, we'll look at some of the arranging techniques that they use and also how you can employ all of these concepts into your own music. There is a PDF study guide down below so that you can follow along with this lesson, as well as a couple of playlists with links for music that I talk about during this video. There are also chapters so you can easily navigate the content. If you like this video, give a thumbs up. For more content, please subscribe, and to be notified, ring that bell. Leave any comments or questions down below. Also, you would greatly help out this channel if you could buy me a cup of coffee. There's a link for that as well down below. Thanks so much for watching, and let's get right into it. There's no doubt that since its 1977 release, Steely Dan's Asia has been a highly influential album on multiple levels. It's widely considered to be a great example of high-quality 24-track analog studio production. The team of producer Gary Katz, engineer Roger Nichols, as well as additional engineers such as Elliot Shiner, Bill Schnee, and Al Schmidt, along with mastering engineer Bernie Grundman, captured, mixed, and mastered an album of incredible fidelity and clarity. The album's personnel is filled with the top musicians of the day. This team of creatives allowed the skillfully crafted and complex pop songs written by Donald Fagan and Walter Becker to be realized, with a beautiful combination of precision and soul that has kept the album fresh and relevant for over 45 years. Donald Fagan grew up in the suburbs of New York City and, according to interviews I've read and listened to, had more than a passing interest in jazz. He's talked about going into the Village Vanguard in the 1960s to hear all of the jazz greats that were working at the time, and later as a teen, he also started to listen to rhythm and blues music. If you listen to the progression of songs found on Steely Dan albums starting with Can't Buy a Thrill, you'll hear a definite Latin influence on Do It Again, and the song Midnight Cruiser has some compositional elements found in Asia, but for the most part the music is rock/R&B influenced pop music. Countdown to Ecstasy starts off with the jazz blues stylings of Bodhisattva, which has some of the elements of a Billy Cobham track, Quadrant 4, from his Spectrum album. I actually think this was a coincidence, as both albums came out in 1973 and was more reflective of musical trends at the time. Razor Boy has almost a Horace Silver vibe to its Latin groove. That being said, this album has the R&B/pop rock feel to many of the songs here. In 1974, Pretzel Logic starts the band being a little more comfortable with showing their jazz influences. While the music is still R&B pop rock, Ricky Don't Lose That Number starts out with the same groove as Horace Silver's famous composition, Song for My Father. They also cover Duke Ellington's East St. Louis Toodaloo, and they have a song titled Parker's Band that is a tribute to Charlie Parker and features dueling alto sax solos by, I think these are the people, but by Jerome Richardson and Ernie Watts. The next album, Katie Lied, has the song Your Gold Teeth 2 with a beautiful jazzy guitar solo by Denny Diaz. There are also bluesy songs with shuffle/swing grooves like Chain Lightning and Black Friday. Their next album, The Royal Scam, features a song, The Caves of Adamira, with some very advanced harmonic language for a pop song. On the song Green Earrings, you can hear sort of a foreshadowing of the kind of stylings that I Got the News has, moving 3-note chords over a bass line and parallel 7th chords moving stepwise. All of this leads us to Asia. This album was a step forward in recording clarity, and while it retains many of the R&B influences of the previous albums, it has several songs with very sophisticated harmonic progressions. The title track Asia, Deacon Blues, the chorus of Peg, and there's a link to my tutorial on that track in the description, Home at Last, and Josie, as well as the topic of today's tutorial, I Got the News. This album was also extremely popular, going double platinum, 2 million albums sold in the US within the first year. In order to see why they felt so comfortable releasing music like this, it's important to look at the time period leading up to it and how 1977 was the culmination of a movement that started with the Miles Davis 1960s/early 1970s family tree, as well as a few other artists. If we think about who played or recorded with Miles Davis in the decade preceding Asia, we would have Herbie Hancock, Wayne Shorter, Chick Corea, John McLaughlin, and Joseph Zawinul. Starting with Miles' 1969 release, In a Silent Way, the band lineup features Wayne Shorter on sax, Herbie, Chick, and Zawinul on electric piano or organ, and John McLaughlin on guitar. This was the first album in 4 years by Miles to crack the Billboard Top 200 charts, reaching number 134. By this time, rock, soul, and pop music was dominating the charts, and not many jazz albums were selling. The story is that Miles played on a bill at the Fillmore East with a bunch of rock bands, and that experience changed what he wanted to do with music. And this is the time period when he started leaving behind My Funny Valentine and moving more towards groove-oriented music with electric instruments. Miles' next album, Bitches Brew, released in March of 1970, made it to number 35 on the Billboard charts and went platinum with over 1 million sales. This album also had Wayne Shorter, Chick Corea, Joseph Zawinul, and John McLaughlin. And there were more albums by Miles over the next few years that featured a rotating lineup of musicians, but all of the players mentioned here, with the exception of Wayne Shorter, were on various tracks. This led to all these alumni of Miles getting recording contracts and releasing successful jazz fusion albums. John McLaughlin was the first to taste success with the Mahavishnu Orchestra. Intermounting Flame, 1971. I couldn't find album sales, but the debut album by the Mahavishnu Orchestra reached number 89 on the pop charts. Then came 1973's Birds of Fire, with over 500,000 albums sold and number 15 on the Billboard charts. The album that followed that, Love, Devotion, Surrender, with Carlos Santana, sold 573,000 albums. If we look at Herbie Hancock, after Herbie left Miles, he had his Mawandishi band, and he was getting frustrated by the lack of success with that group. And by the way, as an aside, the Mawandishi music is tremendous and everyone should listen to it. Herbie formed the Headhunters, and in 1973, the debut album, Headhunters, reached number 13 on the Billboard 200 and sold over 1 million copies, and for a while, it was the best-selling jazz album of all time. The next album by the Headhunters, called Thrust, reached number 2 on the soul charts and number 13 on the Billboard 200. Could not find album sales for that, but I'm sure if it reached number 13 on the Billboard 200, it probably sold quite a few. If we look at Chick Corea's career after Miles Davis, he was involved with a couple of very esoteric/avant-garde jazz projects, the Arc Trio with Barry Altschul and Dave Holland, and then the Circle Concert with Anthony Braxton playing reeds added to that trio. Then at some point, he decided he wanted to make some music that was more accessible, and he formed the group Return to Forever. The first Return to Forever lineup featured Airto on percussion, his wife Flora Purim on vocals, Stanley Clark on bass, Joe Farrell on winds, and Chick on Fender Rhodes electric piano. And then that got a little bit more electric with Bill Connors on guitar and Lenny White on drums, then moving over to Al Di Meola on guitar. By the time it got to be 1976, Chick Corea and Return to Forever released Romantic Warrior, and that sold over 500,000 copies. Joseph Zawinul and Wayne Shorter met each other on the bandstand, touring with Maynard Ferguson Big Band in the 1950s, and they always talked about starting something together. After this experience with Miles Davis, they started Weather Report. They released a string of albums, and 1977's Heavy Weather sold 500,000 copies, and it reached number 30 on the Billboard 200. Simultaneously, you had an artist named Chuck Mangione, who released an album in October of 1977 called Feels So Good. And it was certified as Chuck's first gold album by February of 1978, and by April the album had been certified platinum and is now way past double platinum status. In the world of pop music, you had the great Stevie Wonder, starting in 1973 with his album Inner Vision that reached number 4 on the pop charts. Golden Lady and Too High, which I've done tutorials on, they'll be linked down below. They had extremely jazz-influenced harmony, and then you had Songs in the Key of Life, 1976, filled with jazz-influenced songs, including Sir Duke, a tribute to Duke Ellington. This sold 5 million copies. If we look at 1976 into 1977, you have Return to Forever, Romantic Warrior, 500,000 albums sold. Songs in the Key of Life, 1976, 5 million albums sold. Heavy Weather, 1977 by Weather Report, 500,000 copies sold. Chuck Mangione, Feels So Good, October 1977. By the middle of 1978, double platinum. Asia, 1977, double platinum. After this time, the musical tastes changed. You had disco and moving into punk rock and new wave. Before we do the breakdown, let's take a look at the personnel. We've got Donald Fagan, lead vocals and synths, Ed Green on drums, Chuck Rainey on the bass guitar, Victor Feldman, piano, vibes, percussion, Dean Parks on guitar, Walter Becker, Larry Colton, guitar solos. There's also a brass section in the track, and backing vocals by Michael McDonald, Clyde King, and others. The track starts out with a 3-note bass line, and then there's also a really great drum part that goes along with that. Playing over the top of this are really nice piano fills. As another aside in terms of jazz influences, if you listen to the beginning of All Blues off of Kind of Blue by Miles Davis, you'll hear Bill Evans playing some triplet figures. It's almost exact in one part of the piano introduction, played by Victor Feldman, who actually played with Miles Davis, which is kind of interesting, right? But let's listen to the sequenced version of this track I did. I'm not playing the recording because I would like to not get this demonetized. We'll take it from a little bit before the melody. Here we are. Talking about some of those piano fills, what he's doing, Victor, is he's playing block chords. And they're like sort of just, and that one part that he's doing, something like that in there, that's really similar to what Miles does. He does that throughout the piece in the interludes between the vocal parts. It's interesting because the song is in C major for the most part, but his fills are typically in C mixolydian. He does use an F sharp in a couple of spots. That's not really the important stuff for what I want to get to with this presentation today. If we take a look at the melody, it's not that complex. He plays around with the rhythm of this depending upon the lyrics that he writes, but that's the basic outline of the melody. You're just going stepwise from an F, E, and then you got some Ds, and then you end up on a C over here. And yes, there are passing tones, and there are other notes that approach those scale steps, but it's just basically a descending scale. And 4, 3, 2, 1 are the scale steps, right? F, E, D, and C. What's interesting about this is the way that he sets those melody notes inside of chords. We have this bass ostinato, right? And then the chords above that. Got a G7 over C, F major 7th over C, and both of those are in second inversion. And then he goes up to third inversion for the F major 7th to the E minor 7th, also over the C. So we've got. And then inside of those chords, the melody is the 7th of this G dominant 7th. It's the 7th of this F major 7th. It's the 5th of this F major 7th, and then the 7th of this E minor 7th. So that becomes a little bit more complicated. And this is really one of the salient features of this song, is that the melody sounds very simple, but it's accompanied by some very sophisticated chords. And what I also like about this is that the melody notes are inside of the chord voicings. So he's using a chord voicing of of D, F, G, and B. And the melody is not the top note, it's the inside note. The same here. Here it goes to the top note, but then again here, it's the bottom note of the chord voicing, right? But they actually, this next bit here, if you notice, he avoids any kind of a B in this melody. G, A, C, A, D, C. That's really cool because here he starts introducing a B flat and E flat into these chords. And you've got these little trichords here, right? Going over the same bass. I call them trichords because they're not triads based on thirds. What they are is incomplete 7th chords. So if we look at right here, a C major 7th chord, that would be in root position with no 5th. Do the first inversion, you get E, B, and C, and then the third inversion would be B, C, and E, and that's this chord here. In the next video, I'll do a more extended, in-depth breakdown of trichords, but for right now, this is just a 3-note chord. The other thing that's nice about all of these right here is that you've got all the voices and the chords are moving in parallel motion here, and they're doing the same thing here. And he's going back and forth between C major here, so there's just only notes found in C major here. And then here, you got C minor because you have the B flat and the E flat in these chords. So he's going back and forth between C major and C minor. During the interludes, when Victor Feldman is doing his piano fills, there's C mixolydian. So all of these things, they're subtle, but they add up to, some really complex stuff, and it also helps with the unfolding of the story of the song. One thing he does here with the arrangement is in the first part of this 4-bar phrase where most of the melody is, where most of the action in the melody is, the chords are sustained. Then here, where you have a little bit more space, including a measure with no melody at all, there's much more activity in the notes. So you've got sustained and active. Let's go to the next page and I'll show you a couple things. So the melody notes here are sustained, and then answering phrase keeps a similar shape and it's more rhythmically articulate and is displaced a beat. So this starts on the downbeat and this starts on beat 2. And if we look here, we go down from B to A. We go here from A to D, so the descending scale steps, and then jumping up and descending again, jumping up and descending again. Now this has the extra note here, which is fine, but you could see the similarity in the shapes. It sort of helps to bind this 4-bar phrase together. It's like a conversation. You have and the answer. Let me go over that again. You have a conversation. Somebody makes a statement. Somebody answers. Really cool. Very interesting. The next thing I want to talk about is that there's a lot of blues influences in Steely Dan songs. And if you look at these songs in particular, Black Friday, Bodhisattva, Chain Lightning, I have Black Friday twice because I like it so much, Peg, Daddy Don't Live in New York City No More, and Cousin Dupree all have sort of modified blues forms to them. And this song is no different in that we are all around a C for 8 bars of melody, and then we go to the 4 chord. Everything gets transposed exactly, starting on the 4 chord for 2 bars. And also when he sings right in this area here, I got the news, it almost sounds like I got the blues. So it's really an interesting amalgamation of styles. So let's take a listen to a little bit of that. We'll go back. Let's take it from where the melody comes in and we can hear the whole phrase. Here we go. I'll go over this next bit in a second, but why I kept it going was that you could almost hear that in this area here, it's sort of like a substitute or almost a prolongation of leading to a 5 chord. Just like in a jazz blues, you might have something that goes 2, 5, 1. Again, being influenced by jazz, playing around with the form and the structure and giving us interesting harmonic language. Now, let's go to the study score for this section. For the first 3 bars of this section, he's playing around with some sort of A minor and some sort of F major and back. And what he does here is the rhythmic feel changes. It goes to the ride cymbal. The chords are still kind of sustained, but they're moving at a little bit faster pace. So in the first part, the G7 was a beat and 3/4, and then the next one was a little bit over 2 beats. Here we've got a dotted 8th note tied, and the next one is a 16th note tied. Here we have a dotted 8th note that starts on beat 2, and a 16th note tied to a half note. Then right here, the same chord voicings moving in parallel, just like at the opening, all 8th notes. Then this rhythm repeats. And what you have here in the right hand are these 4th structures. So what are 4th chords? Well, 4th chords are really inversions of a suspended 4th chord right here. So if we look at E, A, and B, that's an E suspended chord. If we go to the next inversion, A, B, E, that gives us our mu chord or mu chord that Steely Dan is really famous for. And then the next inversion are all 4ths. So that's really interesting. And then another thing is that even though this section here doesn't have a C on this chord or in the melody, it still feels like you're going. You almost You know, the C is almost implied. And again, the chords move in parallel, stepwise parallel motion. And the other thing I'd like to talk about here is that the melody, again, very simple, descending, starting on E. You'll notice that he's not starting any of these melodies on a C. He's avoiding having the C as a main part of the melody. It's a destination at the end. Things resolve down to that, yes. But you're starting somewhere else and you're moving along. And I think that that's something that's interesting to note. These notes are in the middle of this chord voicing. So the E is the middle voice here. The same with these notes until you get down to this last phrase here. And that's just a vocalizing thing, I believe. Then right here, you've got this really interesting section here where the chords go. And then back to them. What are those? Well, again, parallel motion. These are seventh chords in drop 2. So what do I mean? If we take all of these notes and put them so that they're in close position, we get something that looks like this. And this right here is, those are the same notes as an E7 suspended fourth, but we'll talk about that in a second. And then right here we've got this chord. The next one is this. These three chords are very familiar. Well, the beginning starts with G7, F major 7th, to E minor 7th. And what do we have? G7, F major 7th, E minor 7th. And what he does is he takes the second note from the top on all of these chords and he drops it down an octave. So B, G, F, and E, they go down an octave. Now this first chord is a fourth structure on the top, which is kind of interesting. That sort of ties us over between these fourth chords and then moving into this next section here. What is this chord? Well, I think that the F sharp is implied in here, and what that then gives us is what I would say would be a B minor 7th with add 11. That's what I think that is. That's something that you can debate, can have a discussion about that. After that little section ends, it goes back here. Totally outside. We have a D major 7th, an A flat 7th, missing the third, and to a G major 7th. I think it's sort of like, let's do something that's outside just to perk people's ears up and what would possibly fit. What's really cool about this also in the voicings is that the top note stays the same. You have an F sharp on the first chord, a G flat or an F sharp on the second chord. I have it written as an F sharp, and also a F sharp here over the third chord. You've got D major 7th, A flat 7th, keeping the 7th in the top, and then G major 7th, again with the 7th in the top. So the G flat or F sharp, the first chord it's the third, the second chord it's the 7th on a dominant 7th chord, and the third chord it's a 7th on a major 7th chord. What typically happens in a blues progression is that you have a dominant 7th at the end that goes back here, but what Fagan does that's, really typical, you'll find this on Peg also, is and he goes back to this little section here where you're mixing up minor and major. Okay, great. So in this section, we're again expanding upon that A minor to F major that you saw at the end of the verse. What he does here with the bass line is he keeps the same rhythm in the first three notes as, but this time it gets busier though with these extra notes here at the end. So that's a variation. And he brings in your three-note chords here. Right? That's nice. And he keeps it all in the A minor area here, and you finally do get a C note on an A minor chord. And this here is broken up. But you could really think of it as A, C, and D. And then you've got the half step above approach here on the offbeat with this F sharp seventh chord. And then the similar thing, you're keeping the same right hand and the bass line moves down to F and keeps the same pattern going. The drums are busier here, ride cymbal going. Simple melody, basically outlining a triad, C, major triad. So you got G, E, G, E, and ending up on C, a little fill here. That's reminiscent to the end of melody line on the verse. Again, and then 3, 2, 1 here. But in the chord, it's the seventh of the A minor chord. And then the seventh going to the fifth of the F major chord. In this section also, it's Michael McDonald takes over the lead with the background vocals, and there are chord things like this, filling out those notes. These have a tonal transposition. So what I mean by that is that they're all in the key of C or A minor. Whereas in the verse, they're doing exact transpositions, which in classical theory would be called a real transposition. Now, there's a third section to this song. I don't know what you'd call that, the second bridge, but I call it the Tumbao section, and you'll hear why in a second. So let's play that. A tumbao is a bass line typically found in Afro-Cuban music that emphasizes the root and the fifth, much like this does, except in a tumbao, you would start an eighth note earlier. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, and it would be something like that. But here you're going. And then above that, you've got this D minor chord with a descending bottom line. Very cool. Again, taken from a montuno. And a montuno is a figure typically played by a pianist that works in really well with the tumbao. You'd hear things like, here he's keeping the chords sustained, and the melody is just basically following that lower voice here in these chords. The other nice thing about this chromatic melody is that it contrasts really well with all the melodic content so far, which only contained, except for like maybe some bluesy inflections here and there, pitches from the C major or A minor scale. That brings us to the end of part 1 of this video. Again, there are study guides linked in the description box below that are free for you to download. If you've made it this far, thank you so much. Please like, subscribe, share, and I'll be back with part 2 of this video in a couple of weeks. I've got a few other videos to put out before then. I've been Pete Calandra. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you on the next one.